Welcome to Candidate Conversations, part of Delaware Debates 2014, produced by Delaware Public Media in collaboration with the University of Delaware's Center for Political Communication. I'm Delaware Public Media News Director Tom Byrne. This conversation, taped here on the campus of Delaware State University, focuses on the race for U.S. House, and we are joined by the incumbent Democrat, John Carney. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you, Tom, and good to be here at Delaware State University.
First off, we'll ask the most basic question, which is, why are you seeking another term in the U.S. House?
Well, when I ran for Congress back in 2010, I did because the country was facing some pretty significant challenges. And I thought it was a real opportunity for me to continue my public service and to bring kind of a practical sense and experience in state and local government to the national level, where we really needed to deal with our fiscal issues, where we really needed to deal with the issues of education, workforce development, and developing an economy of the future that really built and rebuilt the middle class. So we haven't had a lot of success doing that, frankly, since I arrived in 2011, January. It's been a very difficult time from a partisan political perspective. I remain optimistic, however, that we can address these problems, and that we need people like me, people who bring kind of a centrist, can-do, Delaware way attitude towards dealing with these issues in Washington, and so that's why I've decided to run again.
What would you like voters to know about your qualifications that they may not already know about?
Yeah, most Delawareans kind of know where I come from. They know I'm, one of 9 kids from Claymont. My parents were school teachers. They know I have a kind of public service ethic. They're familiar with my experience in Newcastle County government, state government as Secretary of Finance, and as Lieutenant Governor. And I've developed a really good relationship, I think, with people, a trusting relationship, which I think is probably one of the most important things for any elected official serving in Washington. People get a little skittish as you go down to Washington, D.C., and feel like sometimes you forget about the people back here at home. But I've been doing kind of the Joe Biden train commuting thing, keeps you connected back to our state. Again, I think most people know that. They see me on the train. What they probably don't know is how I operate or try to operate in Washington, working with Republicans in a very direct and purposeful way. Early on in my tenure in 2011, I formed a bipartisan working group with a guy by the name of Jim Renacci, who's a Republican from Eastern Ohio. We've expanded that group to about 12 members, 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans, and we work in a really collaborative, cooperative way, trying to address problems. We've come up with legislation to address making it easier for veterans to get commercial driver's license, making it better for veterans to have their different problems that they're experiencing in a veterans court. We've passed legislation working on both sides to address critical drug shortages, and now we've really started to roll up our sleeves and talk about what we need to get a fiscal plan, talk about some of the trickier issues like immigration reform, tax reform, those kinds of things. So it's something that probably people here don't see, but it's what I told people that I would do as their member of Congress, and it's, I think, important for people to know that.
Let's talk about some issues. Unemployment rate in Delaware has been hovering right around or just above 6%, despite a lot of efforts to create and retain jobs here in the state. If reelected, what do you see trying to do to work on the question of jobs?
So jobs and job creation, strengthening the economy has been my #1 priority since going to Congress in 2011, remains so. In the short term, I work very closely with Senator Carper and Senator Coons. We sponsor and work hard on job fairs across our state. We've been able to connect hundreds of Delawareans with employers and job openings. We've got one scheduled, or a training actually scheduled this week, and we had a job fair for veterans down in Milford and in Middletown last week. What we found is that there are jobs out there in the economy. So in the short term, it's really important to connect people with those job opportunities and to prepare them to be hired.
Right.
We found that as hundreds of people come into these job fairs, they're just really not prepared to present themselves in a positive light, resume, appearance, to demonstrate willingness to go to work. And so we've got a training just on that. And then people just don't have the skills for these jobs that are in the workforce, so directing people to the appropriate training programs. Of course, in the long term, I believe strongly that if our economy is going to be strong from the middle out to build the middle class, then we've got to have those manufacturing jobs of the future, advanced manufacturing. So I've been working a lot on that, part of a coalition of Democrats in the House that support the Making It in America agenda, and I'm co-sponsor of a number of those pieces of legislation, extending the research and development tax credit, workforce skills connection, which is an important part of it, building up skills and helping people establish businesses in advanced manufacturing. I really believe that that's the key. We've seen a resurgence of manufacturing across the country, actually companies bringing jobs back to the U.S. from Mexico, Apple setting up a fabrication facility in Arizona, really a positive sign. So want to work to try to build on that.
I know you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but you know, the latest recession, the federal budget, national debt have been a major issue in Congress. What further efforts can be made in that regard?
Probably the biggest problem we face as a country, and you know, when we had Chairman of the Fed Bernanke in on the Financial Services Committee, and former Secretary of Treasury Tim Geithner and members would ask, what's the most important thing that we can do in Congress to help with job creation and strengthening the economy? And they would always say, pass a comprehensive balanced fiscal plan that controls our deficits and national debt in the long term, but doesn't do a lot of harm in the short term. We've done just the opposite. You know, we've made hurtful cuts in the short term, particularly to those things that are important to learn long-term economic strength, workforce development, education, that kind of thing, research and development. So we need a balanced plan. It has to have a combination of spending cuts and new revenue. And of course, that's the rub. That's where the political differences come. Democrats don't want to cut spending. Republicans don't want new revenue. Well, fact of the matter is we need both. And I'm one of those members that's been willing to take that middle ground, and I was one of only 38 that voted for a budget bill that mirrored some of the provisions of the so-called Simpson-Bowles report, which is a balanced, comprehensive plan. We're going to need all the experts, nonpartisan commentators have said this is what the kind of approach that we need, and I'm going to continue to work towards having that kind of that's the basic function that Congress should do, has to do, and we're not doing. Provide a budget and a fiscal plan for the country.
I want to talk about health care. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, so-called, has obviously received a lot of attention, especially in the House, where there have been repeated votes to either repeal it or scale it back in some way. Where do you stand on ACA, and more broadly, what more can be done to tackle the issues surrounding health care in this country?
Well, I think we should fix the problems with the Affordable Care Act, and there have been plenty. You know, one of the real problems for Delaware is that as a national solution, it was geared primarily for the bigger states, the Californias or the New Yorks, where there are a lot more people, and so there's a lot more competition for the health insurance plans in the private marketplace. Not so much in Delaware. In fact, for that small group, individuals and small business market, which is what we're really talking about, there are basically 3 insurance companies that were here prior to the Affordable Care Act and that are here now. So we need to find ways to make it work in Delaware, and I've been active in trying to advocate for changes. I've been a main sponsor of a significant legislative change that passed the House, is now under consideration in the Senate, which is actually not so much geared towards the Affordable Care Act as it works here in Delaware, but more towards saving 500 jobs of Delawareans who work for Cigna Company on health insurance plans that are in the international marketplace. So we really need to roll up our sleeves, put the political rhetoric aside, address the problems, and there are problems, because we know, going back to our conversation about the fiscal plan, is the biggest component of rising federal government costs is healthcare. If we're able to bend that cost curve down, then it'll solve a lot of problems on the fiscal side.
Another issue in that regard, an increase now in the number of businesses reincorporating overseas in an effort to avoid U.S. taxes. This obviously threatens a large portion of revenue here in the state of Delaware. What can be done to slow that trend?
Yeah, well, a big part of a fiscal plan is tax reform. In fact, I think it's the only way, given the position of Republicans in the House and generally, to get revenue as a part of a comprehensive plan, to do it through tax reform. The idea that you eliminate unnecessary deductions and special preferences in the tax code, use that additional revenue to both lower rates and for some of it to reduce the deficits and the debt in the long term. And so I think tax reform is absolutely essential. It also would address this problem, so-called inversions problem, with companies that are domiciled here, incorporated here, maybe in Delaware, probably in Delaware, certainly here in the U.S., and seeking some foreign headquarters so as to avoid the corporate income tax, which at 35% is one of the highest in the world. Fact of the matter is, we're not benefiting from that high tax rate anyway, because companies are leaving those profits offshore, not repatriating the money, and so we don't get it. So that just doesn't make any sense. We need to be smarter than that. We need to reform that the tax code, bring that rate down. It actually should push revenue up. It'll allow companies to make more investments here in job creation in the U.S. In fact, I'm a co-sponsor of a bill with my colleague John Delaney over in Maryland that would create a mechanism for companies to do that right now before we would do any comprehensive reform, so companies would repatriate the money, pay a lower tax rate to the federal government, but as long as they would invest in infrastructure and capital here in America, creating jobs in the U.S. So that's a critical issue, tax reform, because it's related to so much of what we're trying to accomplish.
I want to talk about education. Delaware moving ahead with implementing Common Core standards. How do you feel about Common Core, and beyond that, what role do you feel the federal government has in education reform?
Yeah, well, I've always been somebody who believed that we establish education policy best at the level closest to where the students and teachers are in the classroom, and that the federal government shouldn't be dictating to states and localities what they should be doing. Having said that, high standards in the world we live in today, where competition for scarce, particularly middle class manufacturing and fabrication, advanced manufacturing jobs, is going to depend on how educated and what the kinds of skills that our young people have. And we're just losing that fight right now. We've got to up our game, if you will. And so I know we need high standards, whether they're Common Core standards or some other kind of standards. They got to be high. They got to be across the board, and we got to be serious about it. And we've got to measure educators and schools and school districts according to how they're doing against those measures. People say all the time, well, teachers are teaching to the test. Well, the other way to look at it is they're educating the students on things they need to know and be able to do, which is what the whole idea of standards-based education is. So I support high standards. I support accountability towards those standards, whether they're common or some. I think we've been, the whole debate over the Common Core, we've lost focus on what's important, which is high standards, intense teacher focus on student achievement for every student, because we're competing, these kids are competing not just against kids that are growing up and being educated in Maryland and Pennsylvania and New Jersey, but in China and India and places around the world. So we've got to be able to compete at the highest level, and we're not right now.
I do want to finish on a thing that's kind of been a thread throughout the conversation, and that is the political gridlock in Washington. How can you continue to work with colleagues from the other party to tackle these pressing issues? You talked a little bit about it earlier, I know. But
yeah, it's kind of the Delaware way. I mean, it's at least an important part of the Delaware way that I learned coming up, working in county government, working for then Governor Tom Carper and as lieutenant governor. Long time ago in the 70s, I think Democrats and Republicans in Delaware learned that if we were going to be able to make thoughtful, good decisions for the people we represented, we had to put our political differences aside after the elections. We have a great tradition in Delaware. It's It's called Return Day. It's the Thursday after the election, and as you know, Tom, at the end of that celebration, we have a ceremony where we actually bury the hatchet. And it's symbolic for sure. But the idea is that campaigns are over. You know, we're Democrats and Republicans, but we're Delawareans first. Let's put those differences aside, roll up our sleeves, and go to work. And that's what we need to do in Washington. I joke with people. I say, when I was first sworn in by Speaker Boehner, I felt like that he was handing hatchets out to all of us to use in a political way. And that's frankly hurting the country. I told Delawareans when I ran the first time that I would try to do as we do here in Delaware, and that is work with the Republicans. That doesn't mean you forget about your principles, but you try to find common ground and common sense solutions, and that's what I've tried to do. It is critical if we're going to address these really serious problems, if we're going to come up with a comprehensive balanced fiscal plan, if we're going to do tax reform as part of that, if we're going to compete internationally with the countries that are nipping at our heels, if we're going to continue to be the strong nation that we've been around the world, we've got to find a way to work together and be an example for those around the world.
All right. John Carney, Incumbent Democrat running for U.S. House.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you so much for your time.
Great.
You can find all of our candidate conversations online at DelawarePublicMedia.org and DelawareDebates.org. Candidate conversations are taped here at Delaware State University and are part of Delaware Debates 2014, produced by Delaware Public Media in collaboration with the University of Delaware's Center for Political Communication. I'm Delaware Public Media News Director Tom Byrne. Thanks so much for joining us.